It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Craig McKinley, Shadow Justice Minister Ellie Reeves, the Chief Executive of the think tank Demos, Polly Mackenzie, and Sebastian Payne from the Financial Times. Today,
a 6-year-old with shrapnel in his skull described, without tears or emotion, watching his mother burn to death in their car after it was hit.
Casualties from a city bombed out, but refusing to surrender. What next for Mariupol? The Chancellor promises some help with household bills, but warns of tough times ahead.
I've always been honest with people. Government can't solve every problem. I wish I could, but I can't.
Even 5p off fuel duty is only going to be £2 off filling your car up with petrol. I don't think that really cuts it.
You voted for fire and rehire! Shame on you! Shame on you!
And unions demand more protection for workers after mass sackings at P&O.
I want to see the government take action here to ban this fire and rehire, which is the cause of this in the first place.
And Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is speaking publicly for the first time since she arrived home from Iran. I want to start with the war in Ukraine and the scenes of devastation in the port city of Mariupol. The levels of destruction have resulted in what's being called an estimated 90% of the city's buildings that have been damaged or destroyed. Parts of the city have been razed to the ground, and around 300,000 people remain trapped without power or water and very little food. We can see here the devastation that has been done by repeated shelling and bombing, people leaving the city, fearing for their safety, obviously, and their lives. But as I said, hundreds of thousands of people do remain trapped in Mariupol, which is and continues to be under siege. Now, there have been chilling reports of the deportation, forced deportation of Ukrainians. If we take a look at the front page of The Guardian, it says that civilian deportations from Mariupol to Russia are disturbing and unconscionable if true. This is according to the US, after Ukrainian officials accused Moscow of transporting thousands of people against their will out of the devastated port city. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has also talked about it and tweeted about it, but it hasn't been independently verified. We can talk to our correspondent who is in the west of Ukraine, in the city of Lviv, not far from the Polish border, James Reynolds. James, I've just been showing our viewers and the panel the scenes of devastation from the port city of Mariupol. Can you tell us a little bit more about this Russian ultimatum that seemed to emerge overnight of a deadline to the people in the city to surrender?
It was an ultimatum which said by 5 a.m, give up, surrender. Now, that didn't happen. We're many hours past that, well into the day here. I think anyone who's looked at this would have thought that that was not something that the Ukrainian forces there would have accepted. But of course, clearly what they want is a continued
I'm sorry to say that we're having a few problems here on BBC Two this afternoon. We are doing everything we can to get back on track, and we'll be back with Politics Live just as soon as we can. As you can see, we're still having some problems here on BBC Two this afternoon. We're doing everything we can. Do stick with us. Apologies. We'll be back with Politics Live just as soon as we can. Sorry, we're still having some problems here on BBC Two trying to get back to Politics Live. We're doing everything we can and thank you for sticking with us. We'll be back just as soon as we can. If you've just joined us, you'll see we're having a few problems here on BBC Two this afternoon trying to get back to Politics Live. Still doing everything we can, and we'll be back on track as soon as possible. Looks like we're back on track right now on BBC Two.
That we hadn't seen since the Second World War. People being moved out of, it looks like they're going to labour camps in Russia. You've got 90% of the city destroyed. The problem the West has is if we escalate, what does that mean? And that is the big question. What does that mean? We're supplying with some of the most advanced armaments that the West has, particularly Britain has been very much on the forefront of that. There are transports in from the US of advanced weaponry, and we can see the bravery of the fighting in the Ukraine by the Ukrainian army, and they're still not giving up Mariupol. If we had an answer, I think we'd have found it. But do we escalate, or do we just support from the background, offer humanitarian aid, offer the weapons so they can put up as fierce a resistance they possibly can, and hope there is a change of mind and view within the Putin regime that this really isn't working?
Ellie, people will say that the Russians have escalated it by the sorts of atrocities that we've seen in Mariupol. So again, if that isn't a red line, if it hasn't been crossed, what is in this war?
I think the images coming out of Mariupol are just absolutely horrific and harrowing. A maternity and children's hospital was bombed. Now a school, we're hearing reports that a school has been bombed where people were taking shelter. It's truly shocking. We've been clear that imposing a no-fly zone would lead to, we think, would lead to an escalation, and that's incredibly difficult. But I think that ultimately, we could go further on sanctions than has been done so far. For example, although there is now this register where Russian oligarchs have to declare their property interests. They've got 6 months to do that. And we would have liked that to have gone further. We would have liked a 28-day period for that to happen. So tougher sanctions. We would have liked sanctions to have come into place quicker than they have. We saw Abramovich fly off in his jet. Literally the money was able to leave the country because we didn't move fast enough on sanctions.
Again, apologies for the technical difficulties at the top. I am relieved to see that we are all back in vision. Polly, people will think that if we don't follow through and meet strength with strength in the way a lot of former advisors to Vladimir Putin say is the only way to deal with him, then we're just going to see more of what's just been described there in Mariupol.
I think that's certainly part of the logic of not surrendering and why the Ukrainians want to continue to fight. You might be able to buy a short-term peace with a surrender, but if Putin was able to take Crimea and is then able to take Mariupol, is able to move up, there is no way of preventing him from expanding his territory throughout the whole of Ukraine and then pursuing those territorial ambitions as he has done in whether it's in Georgia or onward into Belarus or Moldova. And that is terrifying for lots of Eastern European countries who existed behind the Iron Curtain and for whom the memories of the USSR are horrifying. The question is, what is the scale of force of power that would be needed in order to get the Russians to rein in those territorial ambitions. And as we've heard, the question, if you do escalate to that level of power, what does that mean for the scale of destruction, which could be, we could see what's happening in Mariupol spread beyond the borders of Ukraine and lead, of course, because Russia does have a lot more power that it can throw at this. It does have nuclear weapons.
Briefly, Seb, your thoughts?
There is really a red line, which is the use of chemical weapons, and I think also the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in these situations, which is what worries people in the Foreign Office and in Washington the most, because at the moment we've obviously got these huge sanctions, we've got a lot of a sort of increasing trade embargo in a way, but we've not yet gone for what you might call the full sort of Cuba option, which is to completely isolate Russia from the international community, and obviously that comes with huge costs, and I think Rishi Sunak has alerted people in the cabinet that if you were to do that, it would knock significant points off not just the UK's economy, but the global economy. But I think it's been made very clear and there was a direct call between Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, and the Kremlin last week, where it was spelled in a lot of detail, if you do use chemical weapons, as Russia did through proxies in Syria, then that would come with much greater consequences. And again, this idea that's been raised that if some sort of tactical nuclear weapon was used in the conflict, that again, I think would take the full Cuba situation. But as Ellie said, I think there is still no appetite for that no-fly zone, because that level of escalation would really potentially push things just too far and lead to consequences that nobody in the West wants to see.
One of the domestic consequences around the world reverberating for the West, particularly, are rising energy prices and the Prime Minister's drive, as he puts it, to make the UK more self-sufficient. We're going to talk about the long-awaited and anticipated energy security strategy. It was due this week. We don't have a precise date. Let's welcome Green MP Caroline Lucas to join us for this part of the discussion. Hello to you, Caroline. If we just have a look at the headline in the Financial Times, it says Johnson in gung-ho push for more nuclear power as energy crisis bites. That's the news, that the Prime Minister today is meeting with nuclear power companies to discuss how quickly nuclear power plants can be built and get online. Ellie, you agree with the government's case for nuclear. Why?
Well, look, nuclear, I think, has an important role to play as part of a mixed energy strategy. And one thing that is absolutely clear is that the government's energy policy has failed for the last 12 years. We are far too reliant on imports from Russia. The Prime Minister's gone cap in hand.
Although the levels aren't
Saudi
anything like
Arabia.
Europe and particularly Germany. We are talking about 4 or 5%.
But we're in a situation where what's happening globally has a huge impact on us domestically.
That's true.
So nuclear has a role to play.
Right,
actually,
but you agree with that.
We agree that nuclear has a
can
role
I just
to
bring
play.
in Caroline here? Why do you oppose the case for nuclear?
Because it takes a heck of a long time to get nuclear power up and running, and it is massively costly. It is completely perverse to be chasing after costly and slow forms of generating our electricity when there are much faster, quicker and cheaper ways of doing it. It seems utterly perverse to me that we're not properly going for a massive energy efficiency programme. The government has never done that, together with a real investment in renewable energies. We've got battery technology now coming along in leaps and bounds. We've got interconnectors, which means that when the wind's not blowing here, we can import it from elsewhere. We really don't need to be going into a nuclear future where, for example, Hinkley Point, which is the nuclear power station that is being built in the UK right now, is already, it's taken 2 decades from planning to construction. It's still not ready. And the cost is likely to be over £20 billion. The National Audit Office has unsurprisingly said that that is simply not value for money.
Can we afford nuclear? Can we wait for it, Craig?
I think we need a new nuclear strategy. I'm increasingly concerned that we build these one-off supersized stations that cost a lot of money and usually go over the date they're meant to be starting. We are starting this far too late, but we are where we are. I mean, interesting to say, Ellie, that there's only been an energy problem for the last 12 years. It was in '97, I think Tony Blair said that nuclear had no further place in the UK.
Well, it has been
most certainly does. We need that baseload supply. And I hear what Caroline said. I agree with we should be insulating our homes and all that good stuff. I agree with that. But the trouble is with renewables, I'm not at all happy, and I'm surprised that Caroline would be as well, that we commit get young labourers across parts of the world digging up some of these rare metals so that we can tick boxes in Islington and elsewhere that we're being ever so green and lovely with battery-powered technology. I mean, she knows where some of these rare metals come from. They come from parts of the world that need some care and attention, not committing more what I'd call raping of the natural world with young labour to actually dig this stuff up.
Where are you talking about?
Democratic Republic of Congo, where a lot of the world's cobalt comes from. These children work under unspeakable conditions. So to think we want more of that, sorry, I want less of that. In my view, renewables just doesn't have the capacity for keeping that energy for when we need it. We are living in a decade of gas, whether we like it or not. I'm certainly hoping nuclear will have the answer. I'd rather have.
But you want to stick with gas until that. You want that to be the transition. Caroline,
absolutely,
do you want to respond?
It's transition fuel.
There is so much, frankly, tosh in what Craig has just said. It's difficult to know where to start. I'd love him to explain, for example, where he thinks uranium comes from. Of course, he's right that supply chains need to be properly monitored, and we need human rights from start to finish. And we need to make sure that when we are extracting things like cobalt, that we are then making our products such that they can be reused at the end of their use. So I certainly agree with them on that. But as far as I know, that when you're looking at nuclear or anything else, the supply chain has the same problems. The issue is with gas. Why would we try to get ourselves out of a crisis that's been caused by high prices of fossil fuels by locking ourselves into more fossil fuels? The idea that Craig and others spout is that somehow by having homegrown gas, then that's going to mean that it's going to be cheaper. That is simply not the case. The gas that we might extract from the North Sea or from fracking will be sold on global markets, European markets at international prices. It does nothing for our energy security. It certainly does nothing for the climate emergency. And I would just remind everybody there is a climate emergency out there too. And for Boris Johnson to suggest that we need some kind of climate pass while we sort out this because there's a national security
I would say domestic supply.
Climate crisis is a national security alert.
It's better than paying hundreds of billions to Putin every year so he can rain terror on the Ukraine. I would have thought that's a pretty easy
Absolutely,
answer.
Craig. And the way to do that is not to go cap in hand from one tyrant to another. And you know that your Prime Minister has just been in Saudi Arabia trying to get some fossil fuels from him. The way to do it, and the way we can easily do it, which is why this debate is so frustrating.
Let's see if it's easily.
Is through energy efficiency and renewable energy.
Well, we'll talk about how easy. We'll talk about how. I'm going to come back to you because I'm going to let the others respond. But in terms of the transition, because this is what we are, talking about, people will be watching and thinking, what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? I know it sounds very simplistic, but people will be thinking about that. How do you bridge that gap? We've just heard from Caroline that she doesn't want nuclear for the reasons that she said. Is Labour in favour, or at least would support, new licensing for oil and gas exploration for this year to tide us over?
Well, look, I think in terms of energy security and what we want to see, we've talked about nuclear, but actually what we want to see is homes properly insulated. So we would insulate 19 million
and that will take a long time as well, and everybody is in agreement with that. But until that, there is a gap to be bridged. How would Labour do it?
Well, I think we need to look at all the different options, nuclear,
including new licences for oil and gas.
Well, I think we need to look at that very carefully to see, but certainly insulating homes, increasing onshore wind and solar and offshore wind as well, all play part of that mix. And, we look at things like gas storage, which has been depleted under this government, which has caused a lot of these problems in the first place. There has been a failure, and now we need to look at getting the right mix
there were 6
as we
days
transition.
in July last year where we had zero wind. 6 days. That means you have to have more than the capacity you think you need just to tide things over, if you can actually store that energy. That is the big dynamic that we don't have in the mix.
Right, and that's the problem. That makes people nervous, Caroline, because it's called, intermittent supply, and people worry about it. And you can see why they may then feel that extending fossil fuels or exploring new licences for oil and gas exploration here might be the answer. I mean, you mentioned interconnectors, but that would still mean getting energy from elsewhere, so we wouldn't be self-sufficient.
We're not going to be completely self-sufficient under any example that we're looking at right now. But can I just point out to you that without David Cameron's effective ban on onshore wind farms that he brought in 2015, we'd actually have avoided any need for Russian gas. So there is a solution staring us in the face around the 649 onshore wind and solar schemes that are in the planning pipeline, but they haven't yet been built because the government hasn't been supporting bringing those to market. If that happens,
where do you store the energy when the wind doesn't blow?
Gas.
Where do you store the energy?
Well, I've just explained what happens when the wind doesn't blow, Craig, which is that you import it from other countries where the wind is blowing. You have battery, you have battery technology, which is increasing all the time. But Jo, I wanted to come back to something that you said, because you said, why don't we go ahead with these new licenses for oil and gas industry in the short term? The point is, it's not the short term. A new license can take 28 years if you start from exploration to bringing that onto the ground, on being able to use it. 28 years, that is not fast. If you want fast and if you want cheap, then the way to do it is absolutely through renewables and energy efficiency. They can get us where we need to be.
Well, we're going to talk about cheap. We're going to talk about cheap in just a moment in terms of who pays for that transition. Well, Polly, what's your view about this sort of short-term and long-term problem?
Well, the short-term problem is almost no one's talking about it. We can talk about nuclear and gas exploration, all of those things are going to take more than a decade to have any impact at all. And we have a crisis of such extraordinary scale. Energy bills could go up to £4,000 on average. And this summer might be tolerable for people, just about. But when it comes to next winter, we have a serious absolute poverty crisis on our hands for millions of families, and in particular, disabled people, and elderly people who tend to need higher energy use because, for example, they may have oxygen concentrators, dialysis machines, electric wheelchairs. And at the moment, the only thing that is being offered to them is, a couple of £100 off their energy bills for 1 year only. We need to provide direct support to people through DLA or PIP or through the pension credit to help people afford those bills. And we need to spend this summer, the next 9 months before it gets cold again, having an emergency, massive scale programme on exactly what Caroline's talking about, which is energy efficiency.
Right, and we've got the spring statement coming up in a couple of days on Wednesday with the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, where he says he is going to stand by people. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But to come back to this issue of what is and what does the transition look like if there is this commitment to net zero in the way the parties have set out, and the tension between both sides you've heard here.
Well, you'll be surprised to hear Boris Johnson wants to put himself right in the middle of those two positions. So he wants to go for the small-scale nuclear, and as we report on the front of the FT this morning, he's gone gung-ho about it, had something of a Damascene conversion to the benefits of small-scale nuclear. But of course, that will take time. We're talking about, seriously, about a decade until you can get these kind of plans tested, built and up and running. So a lot of the nuclear plans, both small and large scale, are not based on old technology. They're trying to be more efficient, and that's going to require suitable testing. So obviously they need to be safe. But on the other hand, many of the renewable forms, wind power is one of the cheapest forms of electricity in the UK at the moment. And that's developed over the past decade. So I think what Boris Johnson is going to try and do is do nuclear sort of the next decade, focus on North Sea oil and gas for the immediate now, and try and fill that in-between space with wind. And to me, that feels like the right place to get a combination of all these things. There's not a single way to get through this. But I think Polly's entirely right that the most immediate problem for the government is the next winter, because these bills are going to go up, and if the Chancellor does cut fuel duty, which I think is almost a given, that helps one element of this cost of living crisis, but not the energy crisis. And I think when we come to the full budget later this year, there's going to have to be something quite substantial, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see the government pumping huge sums of money into universal credit to try and help those at the very bottom who are suffering with sort of food and energy costs, because there is no quick fix to this, simply.
Right, we're going to talk a little bit more about the spring statement and the sorts of policies you've outlined. Caroline, I know you have to go shortly. Just briefly, your response to all the reports that there could be a 5p cut in fuel duty.
I don't think that's very targeted. It certainly doesn't help the poorest people. And I absolutely accept that people absolutely do need help right now. We are facing massive poverty. What I would want to see is a windfall tax on the energy companies. That needs to be front and centre of Rishi Sunak's budget statement. We've had some appalling statements from Bernard Looney, the chief executive of BP, basically saying that his company is now like a cash machine because they're on course for over £10 billion of profit. He's just had his salary double to over £4 million. This is absolutely obscene at a time when people are struggling so much. And as Polly said, it's going to get very, very much worse by the end of the year.
Caroline Lucas, thank you very much. What about that windfall tax?
Well, I think it's complete nonsense. They already get taxed at 40%, one of the highest sectors of taxation.
Yeah.
We are now looking or courting a lot of these companies to say, yes, we need North Sea gas. That needs investment. By taxing these people, they will say, do you know what? The UK is not a place that's serious about energy. We'll go somewhere else.
Well, you don't know that, do you? I mean, there's
well,
not...
I think they would. 40 pence in the pound
but do you think it would work as a short-term fix for millions of households?
No, I don't think it will.
Why not?
I don't think it will, because also these companies are at the forefront of many of the renewable sector investments as well. So we take that money away from them. Number one, they'll say, well, Britain is not a very good place to do business, and probably other investors might think the same. And, you know, the profits that they derive will be ploughed back into some of the things that probably Caroline really wants. Right. If we deter them from that, I think we'll be doing ourselves a disservice.
This is
and it doesn't say much for UK PLC as a place to do business.
Labour's policy, this, of course.
Absolutely. And, you know, I have constituents that are making horrific choices around heating their homes and buying food at the moment.
But this would be a short-term fix. I mean, it wouldn't go on year after year, would it?
Well, the reality is that we are facing a crisis, a cost of living crisis, and you know, I'm sure that Craig's constituents aren't immune from this. And if you have a windfall tax on the gas and oil producers, you can immediately reduce energy bills by £600 for those that need it most, £200 for almost everyone else. And that makes a real difference to people up and down the country.
What about the costs of net zero and that commitment that has been set out by the government? Do you think the government's been honest with the public about the true cost of achieving it?
No, and I think it's a mistake not to be upfront with people. So we at Demos did a big exploration with more than 20,000 citizens going through their choices, how they would propose to meet net zero, being transparent about what the impact on their household bills would be, what the impact on the poorest household bills would be. And actually, what we discovered, the vast majority of people, they're up for it. They make choices which reduce the costs for the poorest, but they are willing to make the adjustments, and they want government to lead on that. Because the reality is that the costs of not getting to net zero are much, much worse. And also, as we're seeing, the cost of our lack of energy security is pumping money into regimes like Russia, like the Saudi government, which then put geostrategic kind of pressures on us, which we are going to have to pump money into our defence systems to support. So when you think about the whole system, it's clear that actually the pathway to net zero is probably the cheapest option in the long term for global security as well as the nation's economic
The Public Accounts Committee did a report on net zero cost of just a few weeks ago, and it was fairly scathing, actually, saying there was no idea about cost, no idea about the technologies, and no idea about how to replace some of the taxes that would naturally go, i.e. fuel duties, if we all went towards battery cars.
Yeah, which is why the government should open up.
It's completely unknown. Nobody knows what this costs. Everyone says, I love it, it's a great idea, oh, here's the bill of it, and then the public starts saying, why are we doing this when the UK is a 1% outputter of CO2 and China is 30% and growing? People start asking questions.
Because we can be more resilient, because we can have, you know, more strength in Europe, because we can grow our economy by being one of the first to adapt. And you're right that some of the last bit of the pathway, 2040 to 2050, is much more uncertain because projecting forward how technology will develop is very difficult. But certainly the pathway to where we need to get through over the next decade is really clear around the changes that we need to make to the way we use energy, the kind of food we eat, the transport we use. And actually, again, I'll send you the report. The public are up for those changes.
I think we'll get there, but it's going to be backloaded. Between 2040 50 is going to be the key.
But if we do it, we have to go further. That's the thing.
We're now investing in technologies that people don't want and don't work very well. That's my worry. I mean, how many in this room here have got an air source heat pump? Would you really want to invest in one? £20,000 if you've got an older house, change all the radiators, dig everything up. It's just not a feasible solution.
Can I talk about bills, energy bills, and the percentage that goes to green levies? Because it also incorporates social costs as well. Do you accept that? And social costs to help people pay for their heating bills?
Well, it all depends where you want the tax take to come out of. How do you want the pie to be split? Should we be doing these things out of general taxation, or loading the lower paid with 23% of a surplus on their energy bills. That, to me, doesn't seem like very good distribution type of taxation.
Ellie?
Well, look, I think the reality is that a better way of dealing with rising energy bills is the windfall tax. It's not saying, let's get rid of green levies. It's really, really important. I think we can't afford not to be committed to net zero.
But do you accept that that does put up people's bills to some extent, even if it's not that big a proportion?
To an extent, but the reality is that the energy crisis is caused by a whole range of issues and not the green levy. And we can't afford not to achieve net zero because of the impact of not reaching it. And actually, we do need to be leading the way. We need to be investing in green jobs and growing the green economy. And that will be good overall for the country. So I don't think we should be ignoring net zero because times are currently tough. We should be looking at ways to ease the burden for households.
Well, I saw a report last week saying, trying to analyse what the green jobs have been, what they are likely to be, and what you're finding is many of the offshore wind farms and the solar panels are actually built in China on the back of 1 pence a kilowatt hour coal power. So, the green jobs have not been happening, and I can't see it happening at all.
If you go out to Grimsby, if you go out to Hull, you can see all the factories that didn't exist there that are creating those green jobs, and in terms of wind turbines. But then also, if we're looking at these new nuclear stations, that again will provide.
Where's the steel coming from? Ask them where the steel come from. Well, it's not the UK.
Well, obviously, you've got the question about the West Cumbria coal mine, which is still up in the air, which I'm sure you'd want to see go ahead. And there is this wider question, of course, about our energy national security here. But the politics of this are interesting, because it was in the Tory manifesto that you stood on to hit net zero and to get there. And the Prime Minister has made this.
Oh no, I've got no problem with 2050. It's how we get there.
All right.
This is not the way to get there.
Well, let me just show you this tweet here. Vote power, not poverty. We regret to announce that we have taken the decision to cancel our rally in Bolton on Saturday. This is from Nigel Farage's new campaign group, Vote Power, Not Poverty. They were due to have a rally next week to campaign against net zero policies, but have cancelled it because they say they've had threats and intimidation by people and groups determined to stop any kind of free and democratic discussion on the disastrous net zero plans. Now, it's interesting because Seb's just raised the idea, well, not the idea, the fact that it was in the manifesto. So it's not exactly a hidden agenda, is it? I mean, is there really
the costs have been hidden. There's no doubt about that. Costs have been hidden.
And is there a genuine interest in a net zero referendum, Craig?
I haven't really got great interest in it because if there is a eureka technology in a few years' time, I'll be fully in favour of that. I want energy that's cheap, available, energy security, and if something comes around the corner, I know it's a long way away, but since I was in short trousers, we've been talking about fusion. I'm sure that we'll be talking about it in 30 years' time. But say that type of eureka technology came forward, then we would be embracing it, and we'd be very, very pleased to do so.
We should also remember that obviously there are many people in the Conservative Party, including I think many of Craig's colleagues, who are concerned about the rise of Nigel Farage and his kind of whatever movement he has, that following obviously the Brexit Party, and Brexit is now sort of just about done, he'll give or take a bit. It's now moved on to this net zero campaign here, and I think many people on the populist right see this as a way of gaining traction with those voters across England. And of course, the biggest thing that could disrupt your re-election plans in 2024 would be a new challenger party to the right, and they obviously think they can get traction with net zero.
No, I appreciate that. In many of our seats, lose 5% and we're in big trouble. Yes, absolutely right.
All right, we're talking about 5%. Ellie, on the 5% cut that is rumoured to be sort of announced by the Chancellor on Wednesday to fuel duty, Labour have said they would back that. Do you also feel that there is a risk that it will become permanent, that cut?
I think that, we're clear about it being a temporary cut as we face this cost of living crisis. But, in the longer term, we do want to see the windfall tax because, ultimately, the fuel duty isn't going to assist everyone, and it's not going to make a huge amount of difference in any event. So we do need to look at other things like the windfall tax, which would cut people's domestic energy bills.
There is, though, briefly a problem, isn't there, with temporary measures, because it is very difficult to reverse them.
It's always really difficult to reverse. But you have to remember that actually fuel duty is kind of on its way out because we are transitioning away from petrol. And that's a good thing. But it does mean that we need to rethink actually how you tax cars and motorists. So everything, in a way, that we do with fuel duty is relatively temporary. We want the price to be relatively high to create the incentives for fuel efficiency and people to switch. But you don't want it to be so high that it's ruining lives. And at the moment, it's so high that the duty cut doesn't undermine that kind of energy efficiency incentive. So it does make sense. But the reality is we need to think again about what the tax base should look like in a kind of post-transition world. Again, the government just doesn't want to talk about the reality and the complexity of this policy agenda. We've still got a tax base that's built on old economic infrastructure. And if we don't reform and move to a tax base that's suited to a low-carbon economy, we are going to end up with not enough money to pay for the public services that people
And I'm not sure we'll hear much about that on Wednesday. Really briefly.
No, because that 5p cut which we talked about, that would cost the Treasury, I think, about £2 billion a year. And that is a lot to take off your tax revenue permanently. And as you said, you know, income tax came in many hundreds of years ago to pay for the Napoleonic Wars, and it's still with us today. So I think if you cut fuel duty now, you'll have a really hard job at increasing it later this year or next year.
Let's return to the story we brought you at the very beginning of the programme about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe giving a press conference. She's been talking. Let's just hear a little bit of what she said.
I grant what Richard said to thank the Foreign Secretary. I do not really agree with him on that level. I was told many, many times that, oh, we're going to get you home. That never happened. So there was a time that I felt like, do you know what? I'm not even going to trust you, because I've been told many, many times that I'm going to be taken home, but that never happened. I mean, how many foreign secretaries does it take for someone to come home? 5? It should have been one of them eventually.
Well, interesting question there posed. How many foreign secretaries does it take? What did you think of that?
Well, that's obviously, I think, some coded remarks towards the Prime Minister there, because, of course, when he was Foreign Secretary and made that infamous Select Committee appearance where he made some comments that were widely seen to have made Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's situation worse. But I think, fundamentally, it shows the difficulty that the British state has had with this whole issue, because we came so close to a deal last year to bring Nazanin home, and it was collapsed because America was not fully on board with all of the people that they wanted to bring back, including Murad Tabaz, who's still out there.
I was going to say, there is
well.
a third detainee still there.
Exactly, and it shows the issue of dealing with Iran in this situation is that obviously that historic debt which became the totemic issue, which the UK has now paid, and it says it's got various checks and balances to make sure it goes towards humanitarian causes, but I think we'll have to see how that one does play out there. But you can understand Ms Zaghari-Ratcliffe's frustration here, how long this has gone on, how many foreign secretaries have tried to get her home, and I think obviously a lot of people across the spectrum have praised Liz Truss for bringing a new dynamic and coming and actually making that happen there. But, I think it does pose big questions for British diplomacy and why this took so long.
And, in fact, sitting alongside Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Richard Ratcliffe was the daughter of Murad Tabaz, who, as we say, is still there, unable to come back. Let's have a look at the front page of The Mirror. This story, very dramatic story, was breaking when we were last on air on Politics Live. It's the ferry scandal, P&O in the dock. Later on today, MPs will debate that decision taken by P&O Ferries last week to sack 800 staff without warning. The Chancellor yesterday in an interview called the move awful and wrong and appalling. The company said they took the decision as a last resort and only after full consideration of all other options. Ellie, we've heard today from the Labour leader saying that he wants these workers reinstated into their jobs. How?
Absolutely. Look, what P&O have done is absolutely outrageous.
I think most people agree with that.
Yeah, and P&O, as I understand it, want to replace the workers with cheaper staff. It's fire.
But how do you reinstate? I mean, he said this, Keir Starmer, this morning, which is very laudable, I'm sure. But how do you do it?
There are a number of things that I think the government could do to make P&O Ferries move on this. I mean, the parent company sits on the government's Transport Advisory Board, for example. I mean, they shouldn't be anywhere near that, having behaved in this way. The government could also look at the contracts and licensing process for P&O Ferries. And there's also this issue where you're making mass redundancies. There is a legal obligation to notify the Secretary of State and consult with workers. If P&O haven't done that, then there are not just employment consequences, but there can be criminal sanctions for failing to notify the Secretary of State. So I think there's some very, very serious questions that need answers to, and that the government needs to be, not just saying this is outrageous, but actually taking those meaningful steps to see action.
Well, you're you're nodding away there in agreement.
No,
I mean, they say...
all these statements. What can be done about it? We've got the Insolvency Service has been appointed to actually look at the contracts and whether this was actually a legal way of doing things, which, you know, looking at it from the outside looks very, very doubtful. You've got DP World, the holding company, is involved in some way in the Freeport proposal for Tilbury, so there's lots of pressure points.
Well, do you think the government should say they have no
I think they
access
should be using these pressure points absolutely massively. I mean, this type of corporate behaviour, what I suggested, and I did it very clearly on Twitter, was saying if you've got a choice of who you're going to use your ferry, consumers, don't use them, boycott them. They may come back to the table, and if they do go skint, well, that's it, done.
Right. I mean, do we need...
I've got no time for these people. They've 600 people in Dover and my constituency work for that company. I've probably only got about 100 in mine. Mainly they're in Dover. But yes, I'm feeling the ramifications of this. This is going to be a hit to the local economy. Perversely, some of this is fuel-related, I'm sure, fuel costs.
But interestingly, the Labour MP, the Labour MP, your colleague Barry Gardner, has written in the Mirror inside the paper to say that the Stop, Fire and Rehire bill he drafted would have stopped P&O in its tracks and allowed workers to secure an injunction to reverse the sackings. But the government blocked the bill. Was that a mistake?
I mean, I was there for when Barry's bill came through. It was a private member's bill.
Yeah.
I don't think it would have caught this example, actually. It was more fire and rehire of the same people with a poorer contract.
Well, a bit like British Airways.
Well, that's another gap in the law, and that's why, you know, we're calling for tougher employment rights to be introduced. I was an employment rights lawyer for over a decade before coming into Parliament. I'm not sure I've seen a lot of things over the years. I'm not sure I've seen anything as bad.
Well, no, I don't think anyone has. And that was
you have to be careful what you wish for on the employment market. If we make employment very, very complicated for, you know, good businesses, they may be reluctant to take people on and have a very fluid and vibrant employment economy. So if we make it too dirigiste, I think you can have worse effects than having a bit of flexibility and common sense.
Good employers want a level playing field.
Particularly when we've got COVID issues, there will be companies on the brink, and I think at times they do need flexibility, but this one was just an egregious, disgusting company.
New laws required?
Well, I think there's a specific set of questions around seafarers. And
because they have a particular set of laws around that.
P&O, a kind of proud British company, actually, its ships are now registered overseas.
Yeah. I understand these were Jersey contracts as well for these staff.
Yeah, and so the contracting law and the international provisions enable them to behave differently. They're not, in a way, a UK employer. And so the question, I think, for us is to then think about what is the way we deal with companies like DP World involved in our ports infrastructure, involved in kind of critical connectivity like the ferry service and that licensing. Do we want to use kind of social value in procurement approaches to try and expect more than simply the kind of international minimum standard, which is, you know, basically to be paying people just a couple of pounds an hour? Right.
I mean, the prospect of DP World, the company getting access to free ports, I mean, the TUC is saying this should be stopped in all circumstances. Do you agree?
I think you've got to look at this situation, because if they're benefiting from a government scheme to help them make more money while they're treating works like this, it's very hard to see how that's defensible and why people would want to invest in that. Now, there are people in government who are trying to draw a line between these two separate issues, because as you were saying, you know, the ferries are not directly linked to this, but it is the overall ownership. And I think there's also a question as well about DP World's contracts for P&O ferries and whether they are still a suitable person to have the licensee to run those services. I'm sure that's going to be looked at, even if they have or haven't broken employment law here, because it's just a basic smell test about, you know, is this good capitalism? And this is actually, for me, rapacious capitalism as its absolute worst, and it's indefensible.
I mean, just very briefly, a risk that other companies will feel emboldened to do the same unless it...
I don't think so. I mean, I can't imagine
Look at the backlash.
I can't imagine what was happening in that board of P&O to think, what is this going to do to our corporate reputation? It's trashed it, and rightly so.
Just time for me to say apologies to viewers again for the technical issues throughout the programme. And, of course, thank you to all of my guests for bearing with us. And I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live. From all of us here, have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.